What if there's a great story still inside you that still hasn't been told? And what would happen if you actually discovered that story, started telling it, and more importantly, living it? You see, I think everyone's got a great story, but it's still locked inside, and for whatever reason, we don't seem to think it's important enough or worthy of bringing forward. Like, unless we've won an Olympic medal, the Oscars, climbed Mount Everest, or found the cure for cancer, somehow we've been fooled into thinking that our story isn't worth being shared, that no one would be interested, no one would care, and yet a lifetime of experience tells me that's simply not true. My own story has its roots in radio and television broadcasting. For 20 years, I'm a news reporter, sportscaster, TV host, and it was a 20-year, somewhat high-profile gig, and it all came to an abrupt end in the late 90s, on the day I was fired. Yeah, I lost the job. Before you know it, I'm broken, busted, humiliated, standing on the unemployment line. And I had no way of knowing at the time, but I was about to discover, tell, and live an entirely new story. You see, standing on the unemployment line for the first and only time in your life forces you to ask some very tough questions, especially when you've been knocked off this high-profile perch. Am I just a broadcaster, like just another talking head? I mean, is this really all I know and can do? Is this somehow defining who I am? Or is there an entirely different, new, and maybe a better path to follow? And through a series of accidents, I landed in a world I knew absolutely nothing about: soft skills, business training. I mean, I didn't have a clue what I was doing at first. I learned some incredibly tough lessons, and yes, there were the dark days, sleepless nights, and got very reacquainted with craft dinner. But with a lot of hard work and a few lucky breaks, well, I not only learned how to survive as an entrepreneur, but also started forming some original ideas on how to duplicate the winning strategies of successful companies and brands. And then I started writing these strategies down, and then a few years later in 2010, these strategies were actually first published in a book, and then that book opens up a few more doors, and before you know it, I'm winning national awards. I'm sharing speaking platforms with the likes of Richard Branson and Gene Simmons, and I'm on speaking stages everywhere from Italy to Maui, Mexico, and Grand Rapids, Michigan, and hundreds of other cities and towns throughout North America. But that's not the end of the story. Far from it, because lately I've been detecting some entirely new patterns about a fascinating subject called reinvention. You see, we don't have to look very far to find examples of large corporations that have utterly failed when it comes to reinvention. Kodak, Blockbuster. But what if the same principles for successful reinvention, whether it's big corporations, small companies, careers, the common man, what if those principles hinge on the ability and fortitude to discover, tell, and live an entirely new story? See, if you find yourself at a crossroads, doesn't matter whether it's your business, career, health, fitness, relationships, well, your first footsteps on the road to reinvention will depend on the story you choose to tell yourself. And somewhere buried in your past lies the seeds of great ideas, breakthrough moments, compelling stories that you've either completely forgotten about or don't fully appreciate in terms of their value. But if you keep telling the same sad, small story, you keep living the same sad, small life. And if you turn inward, well, you have a chance to discover the magic within your own stories, those grippingly real, gut-wrenching, heart-filled stories of overcoming obstacles, dealing with rejection and failure, and the stories of finding peace and redemption, the lessons learned. When you do that, well, only then can you fully begin to unwrap and embrace a gift that only you can share. That's what I learned on the unemployment line for the first and only time in my life, that I can either be a victim of my story or I can create my story. It's a choice that tears down the brick walls between us and the best version of us. And the story of any person, company, or community scaling those brick walls to become their best self, we all find that truly inspiring. And a big part of what I do is help companies, corporations, people just like you discover, tell, and live your own story so that you get to create a path of your own making, follow a destiny of your own doing. So what is your story? The one that represents the best version of you, and what would happen if you took those initial first steps to discover, tell, and more importantly, live your own story. Because despite what science says, the universe is made up of stories, not atoms. And the best stories don't have a beginning, middle, end. No, the best stories, just like yours, are the ones with no end in sight.